The letter had arrived on a Tuesday, the kind of English Tuesday where the rain decides it has said quite enough and withdraws to somewhere with more ambition. It sat on the morning table in the sitting room at 221B Baker Street, its envelope cream-coloured and slightly salt-stained, the sort of wear that belongs to a man who has lived too close to the sea for too long. Watson noticed it first because Holmes was asleep, genuinely asleep, his long frame folded into the armchair by the cold fireplace, one arm trailing over the side as though he had simply forgotten to put it away before his mind switched off entirely. It was not yet midday. The light coming through the window fell in pale watercolour bands across the carpet, the kind of light that comes when you are somewhere between seasons and cannot quite decide which one you belong to. Watson was a man of habit. He had arranged the post in order of apparent importance, a thing he did not often do for Holmes, but on this particular morning the consulting detective's unusual stillness seemed to have settled Watson into a tidying sort of mood. The letter, third from the left, bore a Cornish postmark, St. Ives, if he was reading the smudged ink correctly. There was something in the thickness of the envelope too, a sense of weight that did not quite match its thinness. Watson turned it over in his hands, listening to the particular silence that meant Holmes was not reading him a lecture on the crime of mail opening without permission. He broke the seal. The handwriting was cramped but careful, the sort of writing a man produces when his hands know rope better than pen, when every letter is a small act of deliberation. Watson read it once, then again. Then he set it down on the table, aligned it with the edge of the Morning Post, and walked to the window. Outside, Baker Street was conducting its ordinary business. A cab drew up before a house 3 doors down. An errand boy on a bicycle seemed to be having a sincere disagreement with a lamp-post. Pigeons argued about something, territory no doubt, or philosophy. The sunlight, which had been pale when Watson first noticed it, was growing brighter, more certain, as though it had made up its mind about the day after all. "You will want to read this," Watson said, not turning from the window. Holmes's eye opened first. It was a curious thing about Holmes's sleeping face. It contained very few of the lines that marked it awake. In sleep, he looked younger and less certain, as if his mind had simply set down its arguments and gone somewhere quieter. He sat up with the economy of someone who had not truly been away and extended his hand. Watson brought him the letter. The light caught Holmes's face as he read, and for once it was possible to see him think. The particular line appeared between his brows, not concern, not quite, but something closer to interest. His eye moved down the page. He turned it. He read whatever was on the back. He lowered the letter to his lap and looked at Watson. "The lighthouse keeper at Fenwick Head," Holmes said. It was not a question. "You know him?" "I know of him. Competent man. Retired from active service 4 years ago after a fall that left him with a permanent limp. An escape, ultimately, from a position that had become intolerable. The postmark suggests he's still there." Holmes raised the letter again. "But this is not really about the lighthouse keeper. This is about fear. Read it aloud." Watson took the letter back and found the beginning. "To Mr. S. Holmes, Baker Street, London. I write to you because there is no one else who might believe what I am about to describe, and because I have come to the conclusion that believing it myself is no longer quite sufficient. For the past 6 weeks, every night, every clear night, that is, an island not 2 miles from Fenwick Head has been signalling. Signalling, I say, with absolute certainty. It is too regular to be accident, too purposeful to be anything but intention. At first I believed it to be a ship's distress signal that had become confused in its own repetition. But I have some facility with Morse code, Mr. Holmes, and what I read in that light is neither distress nor any maritime signal known to me. It is a message, and it is coming from an island that has been uninhabited for the better part of 20 years. Holmes folded the letter with the kind of precision that suggested he was folding something more than paper. He stood, crossed to the mantelpiece and began to light his pipe. Not the old brown one, Watson noticed, but the smaller, more contemplative stem. "What else?" Holmes asked. "There is a drawing of the island, and a list of dates, the nights on which the signal appeared." "And how many nights is that?" 43. Holmes drew on his pipe. The room began to fill with smoke, and in the particular way of the room, the sunlight began to make its movement through it visible, all those small particles floating down toward the floor like dust made conscious. It was a soothing sight, Watson had always thought, like watching the day think. It troubles him, Holmes said. The letter troubles him more than the signal itself. Notice the salt staining? He has carried this letter for days, perhaps a week, composing it in his mind. The watermarks are sea spray, Watson. Notice how they cluster on the left side, as though he was holding it while standing before something that was being consistent about dampness. The hesitation marks in the penmanship. There are at least 3 where he has crossed out a word and begun again. He is not a man accustomed to uncertainty, but he is uncertain now. Watson settled into his chair, the smaller one, across from Holmes. It was the sort of chair from which one was invited to listen rather than speak, but he spoke anyway. Is it genuine? Oh, entirely. That is what troubles him most, I think. He knows it is genuine. A man who has managed a lighthouse for as long as he has would have no tolerance for self-deception on matters of light and signal. If he says the island blinks Morse code, then the island blinks Morse code. Holmes turned from the window and his eyes had taken on that particular brightness that meant his mind had already left Baker Street behind. But a message from an uninhabited island, night after night, for 43 consecutive clear evenings, that is something that invites rather strenuous disbelief. The sunlight moved across the floor. Watson watched it shift, watched the angle change as the morning advanced toward noon. The pigeons outside had reached some sort of peace, or had simply decided that further argument was wasteful. The errand boy had finished with the lamppost and moved on to other, more encouraging forms of disagreement. "We should go," Holmes said. "To Cornwall?" "To Cornwall. The sea air will benefit your constitution, Watson. You have been looking at London with the eyes of a man who has begun to doubt it is real. We shall take the afternoon train to Penzance, then arrange ourselves at a small inn near Fenwick Head. The weather is unseasonably warm for June. Did you remark upon it? It gives us a week, perhaps, before a proper storm remembers itself and comes Atlantic ward. After that, we may not see the signal at all. The lighthouse keeper will have his certainty, and we will have nothing but questions." Watson began, automatically, to think of the things that would need packing. Clean linen. His travelling clothes, which were sensible. His service revolver, which was less frequently sensible but nonetheless habitual. He rose from the chair. "There is one more thing," Holmes said, not turning from the window where he stood, watching Baker Street go about its business with the kind of focused disinterest it usually reserved for matters of profound unimportance. "What is that?" The lighthouse keeper did not mention whether anyone else has seen the signal, whether anyone else believes it. That omission is interesting, Watson. It suggests either that he is the only observer, which is possible, or that there are observers who have, for some reason, elected not to speak of it. The second possibility is considerably more interesting, I think. It suggests that someone, somewhere, very much wants that island to go on signalling in the dark. The light shifted again, and in that shift something changed. Watson felt it the way one feels the turn of a season, not as something definite, but as an absence of something that was. The pale bands of sunlight across the carpet seemed suddenly to be leaning forward. The room, which had been still, seemed suddenly to be waiting. "Pack light," Holmes said. "We will be staying longer than the weather suggests we should." Within the hour they were in a cab, their bags strapped to the roof, the London streets falling away behind them as they moved toward Victoria Station. Watson sat with his face turned, slightly toward the window, watching the city rearrange itself into smaller, then smaller things, until there was green between the brick, then more green than brick, then finally nothing but green, and the sense of distance. Somewhere ahead, the sea was waiting. Somewhere on that sea, an island was speaking a message that no one seemed to want to understand. And in the sitting room at 221B Baker Street, the letter remained on the morning table, the salt stains on its envelope drying in the afternoon light, evidence of a journey and a question, and a man who had learned to fear the comfort of certainty. The train would take them as far as Penzance. From there, it would be a trap, then a trap pony, then finally the proper Cornish lanes that descended toward the coast, like prose descending into poetry. The lighthouse keeper would be waiting. The island would be there, 2 miles offshore, patient and dark and full of the kind of secrets that only come out at night, blinking in a language that almost made sense. And the warmth, that unseasonable, unsettling warmth that had made Holmes pause at the window and notice, would hold for another week, perhaps. Long enough. long enough for the light to reveal what it had to reveal, long enough for the signal to be heard. The train journey to Penzance was the sort of travel that teaches a man about patience. It teaches him, too, about the particular sound that rails make when they are being honest about distance, a rhythm that is neither quick nor slow, but rather resigned, as though the train itself understands that getting there is less important than the various ways one might think about arrival while getting there. Watson spent much of the first 3 hours reading a novel he had abandoned in London, finding that he could read the same paragraph 3 times and still not retain a single word of it. Beside him, Holmes had closed his eyes not long after they left the station, but Watson had long ago learned that Holmes's closed eyes did not signify sleep so much as they signified a particular kind of thinking, the sort that required the world to be temporarily switched off so that the mind could conduct its business in peace. The countryside slipped past. England was being itself, gentle, organised, the kind of landscape that had been arranged and rearranged so many times by human hands that it no longer quite remembered what it had been before. Fields gave way to villages. Villages gave way to smaller villages. The light, which had started as pale London morning light, began to shift towards something warmer, something with more intention in it. It was near Plymouth that Holmes opened his eyes. "You have been rereading the same passage for the last 20 minutes, he said without looking at Watson. "The novel is not to blame. Your mind is elsewhere. You are wondering, I imagine, what sort of man signals from an uninhabited island for 6 weeks and expects no one to notice, or, alternatively, signals in the full certainty that someone will. The difference between those two possibilities is considerable." Watson set the novel aside. "I was wondering, actually, if we ought to have brought more information." The letter contained almost nothing concrete. A description of light, a postmark, and the assertion that the keeper has a facility with Morse code. That is hardly evidence of anything. "On the contrary," Holmes said, finally turning to look at him, "the letter contains everything. The lighthouse keeper is a man who has spent 30 years in a profession that requires absolute accuracy in the face of ambiguity. Fog obscures, but light does not lie, or rather, light only lies when something is deliberately placed between it and the observer. That such a man should write to me with hesitation in his penmanship suggests that he is not hesitant about the facts themselves, but about their interpretation. He knows what he saw. He is uncertain about what it means." The train carried them onward. The landscape began to change more noticeably now. The fields, which had been flat and serviceable, began to develop opinions about themselves. They rolled, they declined. They suggested increasingly that the land remembered something about hills, and that it was being reminded of that memory by something large and wet that was approaching from the western horizon. By the time they reached Penzance, the sun was low and orange, and the air that met them on the platform carried the salt memory of the sea, not fresh, not quite, but old salt, the kind that has been sitting in things for centuries and has learned to be patient about its own return. They secured a trap from the station master, a sturdy little vehicle pulled by the sort of pony that seemed to have been constructed from stubbornness and an intimate knowledge of Cornish roads. The driver was an old man whose face had the weathered quality of something that has spent a long time thinking hard thoughts in salt air. He did not ask them many questions, which Watson appreciated, and when Holmes named their destination, the driver merely nodded as though this was the sort of thing men did in June. Travelled to lighthouses on the coast and looked at islands. The road descended toward the sea in a manner that suggested both intention and reluctance. There were curves in it, and the curves had clearly been argued with at some point in their construction. On either side, the landscape was becoming something different from what it had been. Wilder, perhaps, or simply more honest. The grass grew thick and with less regard for neatness. The stone walls that bordered the road seemed to be engaged in an ongoing negotiation with the wind about which direction they ought to be leaning. And then, gradually the sea revealed itself. It happened the way such things do, not as an announcement, but as a growing awareness, a realization that what had been sound and smell and the taste of salt on the wind was now also visible, was now a fact written in grey blue across the world. The horizon was there, and it was considerable, and it seemed to contain within it all the weather that England had ever decided it could spare. Fenwick Head announced itself as a collection of stone buildings clustered around a lighthouse, that stood with the kind of stance a man might adopt if he had decided to stand in the sea and dare it to say something about it. The lighthouse was whitewashed and sure of itself, and beside it stood a small house, the keeper's residence, Watson assumed, with windows that faced toward the water as though they had learned to look for something that came from that direction. The driver deposited them at the gate and collected his payment without comment. Holmes and Watson stood for a moment, watching him depart, both feeling the particular displacement that comes from arriving at a place one has only read about in correspondence. The wind here was serious. It had an opinion, and it was delivering that opinion with regularity. A man emerged from the keeper's house as they stood there. A man of perhaps 60 years, with the bearing of someone who has spent a long time in a profession that requires both watchfulness and patience. His hair was grey, tending toward white, and his face was the colour of someone who has spent decades looking at reflections off water. He walked with a slight limp, the legacy of his earlier fall, but moved with practised ease. When he smiled, it was like watching someone translate an internal thought into visible form. "Mr. Holmes," he said, extending his hand, "I did not truly expect you would come. When one sends such a letter, one rather assumes it will be dismissed as the fancy of a man who has spent too long alone. I am Malcolm Cardew, lighthouse keeper at Fenwick Head for the past 4 years, and before that I was various other things, but that is a story for another evening, I think." Holmes took his hand. "Mr. Cardew, this is Dr. Watson. The letter was hardly the fancy of a solitary mind. It was the careful report of a trained observer, and the fact that you wrote it at all suggests that you have exhausted other possibilities before resorting to consulting detective work. Shall we go inside? I imagine you have tea." "I have something better," Cardew said. "I have a view of the island, and I have a question that has been keeping me awake for 6 weeks, which is considerably worse than any insomnia tea might cause." The interior of the keeper's house was not what Watson had expected. It was not, that is to say, the Spartan quarters of a solitary man, but rather something considerably more contemplative. The walls were lined with books, technical manuals about maritime navigation, certainly, but also poetry, history, philosophy. There were charts pinned at various points, and several of them bore penciled annotations in the cramped handwriting of the letter. But it was the window that commanded the room. It faced west toward the sea, and at this hour, with the sun descending toward the horizon, it was filled with the particular orange light of late afternoon. Cardew guided them to it, and they stood together, looking out across the water toward the island that had begun to trouble the keeper's peace. It was small, perhaps a quarter-mile long, Watson estimated, and rocky. There was no vegetation visible, or rather, there was the kind of vegetation that clung to rock because it had learned that this was the only way to continue existing in such a place. A small structure stood at its highest point, barely visible at this distance, something that might have been a shepherd's shelter or the remains of an even older building, worn down by time and salt wind until it was barely distinguishable from the rock itself. "Tell us what you see," Holmes said. He was not looking at the island, but at Cardew. "I see," Cardew began slowly, "a message that is not meant for me, and yet has made itself my concern. Every clear night between 10 o'clock and 11:30, the light appears. It comes from the direction of the old structure. You can barely see it in this light, but it is there, on the far side. It blinks in patterns. The patterns repeat. The patterns follow a code." "Morse," Holmes said. "Morse," Cardew confirmed. "Modified slightly, but Morse in its essence. I have transcribed every sequence. Would you like to see them?" He moved to a small desk in the corner and withdrew a leather-bound notebook. It was well maintained, the pages filled with careful notation, sequences of dots and dashes, each followed by a date and time. Watson felt, looking at these pages, a sudden respect for this man who had not dismissed what he was seeing as lunacy or accident, but had instead begun the methodical work of recording it. Holmes took the notebook and began to read. His eye moved down the pages, and his expression, which had been one of mild interest, began to shift towards something more engaged. He did not speak, but Watson had learned to read the small signs in Holmes's face, the slight tightening at the corner of his eye, the minute shift in the angle of his head. These things meant that his mind was working, that patterns were being recognized or hypothesized. "The sequences are not random," Holmes said finally, "nor are they, I suspect, a distress signal or any maritime communication. but they are repetitive within their non-randomness. There is structure here. There is intention. What is your translation, Mr. Cardew? Cardew moved to another document, this one loose, on the desk beside the notebook. It was a series of hastily written notes, corrections and recorrections, the path of a man trying to make sense of something. That is the difficulty, Cardew said. The sequences, when translated literally, appear to be words, but they are words in no order I can make sense of. Sail, repeatedly, deep, rock, home. These words appear in various combinations, but not as sentences, not as anything coherent. It is as though someone is tapping out the random recollection of a dream, fragments and pieces with no connecting thought. Watson watched Holmes's expression shift again. There was something that Holmes had seen in the notebook that had answered some question in his mind. The consulting detective was quiet for a long moment, then turned back to the window where the island sat, patient and dark in the gathering light. "How many people know about the signal?" Holmes asked. "None, officially," Cardew said. "I have told no one. I received your direction from an old colleague, a man who knew me before I took this position. I did not trust the local authorities to take it seriously, and I trust the general population even less. Gossip in a small community grows like mould. Within a week, it would be the entire village's theory about what the island contained. But unofficially," Holmes said, and it was not quite a question. Cardew hesitated. It was a small hesitation, but Holmes caught it. Holmes always caught such things. "There is a young man," Cardew said at last. "David Tremaine. He is the son of the harbour master in the village, St. Ives, about a mile south of here. He comes out sometimes, ostensibly to walk and take the air, but he has begun to come out on the clear nights. He has brought a telescope. I do not believe he has interpreted the signals, but he has definitely seen the light. He has asked me obliquely whether I have noticed anything unusual about the island recently." "And what did you tell him?" "That the island has been unremarkable for as long as I have been watching it," Cardew said, "which is the truth, and also a considerable lie, depending on how one chooses to define unremarkable." Holmes nodded slowly. He was still looking at the island, but his eyes had taken on that particular quality that meant he was not really looking at the island at all, but at something considerably more invisible. "We will need lodging," Holmes said, "and we will need to examine that structure on the island more closely. It will require a boat and the proper tide. But first, Mr. Cardew, I believe we ought to have that tea you mentioned, and then, if you are amenable, we should take a walk. There is nothing quite like walking along a coastline for clarifying the mind about matters of signal and distance and the particular geometry of intention." Cardew seemed relieved at this. He ushered them further into the house toward a small kitchen where a kettle was already heating, as though he had expected them, Watson thought. Or perhaps as though he had taken to keeping a kettle heating at all times, in the way of men who have learned that visitors arrive in their minds long before they arrive anywhere else. As they waited for the tea, Watson found himself drawn to a small framed photograph on the mantelpiece. It showed a younger Cardew, much younger, standing beside another man. They were both in naval uniform. There was something in the composition that suggested loss, a deliberate memorializing of a moment that was no longer recoverable, except in the amber of an old photograph. "A friend," Cardew said, noticing Watson's attention. "From before the lighthouse. A good man. He died. That is another story, and one for another evening, as I mentioned." But Watson, looking at the photograph, understood something that the letter had only hinted at. Cardew was not troubled by the signal because it was inexplicable. He was troubled by the signal because he had already lost too much to dismiss anything, no matter how strange, as beyond the realm of caring about. The signal, whoever was sending it, had become his concern because loss had taught him that concern was the price of being alive. The sun descended further, and the room began to fill with the particular light of approaching evening, that golden blue hour when day and night negotiate with each other, and the world seems to hold its breath between the two. Outside, the sea continued its work. The lighthouse stood ready to light when darkness came, and on the island, in the small structure at its peak, someone or something waited for the night to fall. It would not be long now. A few hours at most. Holmes accepted his tea and stood by the window, cradling the cup in his hands but not drinking from it. Watson recognized this posture. It was the posture of a mind working through the intricate geometry of a problem that had no immediately obvious solution. Somewhere in what they had learned, somewhere in the description of words that made no sense, somewhere in the knowledge that a young man with a telescope was watching an uninhabited island, somewhere in all of that was the thread that would unravel everything. It was simply a matter of finding it. The walk, as Holmes had suggested, took them along the cliff path that ran southward from Fenwick Head, the route that descended gradually toward the village of St. Ives. The light was changing as they walked, that particular transformation that only happens near the sea, where the sky seems to retain a memory of the day even as darkness begins to claim the lower reaches of the world. The sun, which had been a fact of afternoon, was now becoming a memory, a diminishing warmth on their left shoulders as they turned to walk parallel to the coast. Cardew led them with the ease of a man who had walked this path 1,000 times. His steps were certain, his breathing steady, the kind of physical certainty that comes from years of regular movement over familiar ground. Behind them, the lighthouse at Fenwick Head was gradually receding. Though it never quite disappeared from sight, it was the sort of structure that, once you were aware of it, remained in your awareness whether you looked at it or not, the way one remains aware of a persistent thought. The young man, David Tremaine, Holmes said as they walked, comes, out on clear nights. Has he ever spoken to you directly about the signal? Not directly, Cardew replied, but he has asked increasingly pointed questions about the island, whether it has always been empty, whether anyone has ever lived there, what it contains. Last week he asked me if I had ever heard sounds coming from it on windy nights. That was peculiar phrasing, I thought. Not if I'd seen anything, but if I had heard. That suggests he may have heard something himself. Watson found himself moved by the rhythm of the walk. There was something about coastal paths, he thought, that encouraged thought and conversation in a way that flat London streets could never quite manage. The wind carried the sea smell and the sea sound, that particular rhythm that was almost like speech, if speech had learned to be patient and repetitive, seemed to slow one's thinking to match its own cadence. What is known about his father? Holmes asked. Marcus Tremaine, harbour master for 20 years, a competent man, conscientious in his work. His wife died 8 years ago. The son has been somewhat adrift since then, I think. Not troubled precisely, but without direction. He takes work when he can. Dock labour, some fishing expeditions. He reads more than is common for a young man of his station. I believe he wanted to attend university, but funds did not permit it. Holmes was silent for a moment. They had reached a section of the path where the cliff dropped away somewhat more dramatically, where the wind picked up with more purpose, as though it had gathered its thoughts and decided to make them known. The sea below was beginning to take on the blue-grey of approaching evening, that particular shade that looks both restful and somehow full of secrets. A young man without direction, Holmes said at last, who suddenly becomes intensely interested in a place previously unremarkable. Either he has seen something that has sparked that interest, or someone has directed his attention toward it. The first possibility suggests accident. He has noticed the signal as you have, perhaps even before you noticed it. The second suggests design. Someone wanted him to look. Both are interesting. But the fact that he has brought a telescope suggests that he was not observing from the shore but trying to see something specific on or near the island. That implies knowledge of what to look for. They had reached a point where the path widened slightly, where the landscape allowed for a broader view. It was here that Cardew stopped and pointed. There, he said. You can see it better from this vantage, the structure on the island, and from here, on clear nights, the signal is visible to the naked eye. It takes perhaps 3 or 4 minutes for a sequence to complete itself. Watson looked toward the island. In the fading light, it was a dark shape against a slightly less dark sea. The structure Cardew had mentioned was barely visible, more a suggestion of something built than something actually standing. But there was, now that Watson was looking for it, something in the arrangement of the island that spoke of human observation, as though someone, somewhere, had chosen this exact location to stand, because from this location one could see the island with perfect clarity. What time does the signal begin? Holmes asked. Between 10 and past, Cardew replied. The timing is not perfectly consistent. Sometimes it begins at 10, sometimes later, but it never begins before 10, and I have never observed it continuing past 11:30, as though someone is observing a schedule, as though there is a time when observation is possible and a time when it is not. Holmes turned to look at Cardew. You have thought about this carefully. You have developed hypotheses. I will not ask you to share them. I prefer to develop my own. But I will ask you this. In all 6 weeks of observations, has the signal ever deviated from this basic pattern? Has it ever begun at a different hour? Has the length of the sequences ever substantially changed? The length varies slightly, Cardew said. The rhythm remains consistent, but the number of words, if one can call them words, in each sequence differs. Sometimes 3, sometimes 5, once I counted 7. But the core words repeat: sail, deep, rock, home. These appear in nearly every sequence, interspersed with others that I have not been able to translate consistently. Watson was listening to this exchange and found himself thinking about what it meant to receive a message that one could partially understand but not fully interpret. There was something almost cruel about such a situation. To be close enough to meaning to know that meaning was present, but not close enough to grasp what that meaning was. It was the sort of thing that would keep a man awake, driving him toward the solution less out of intellectual curiosity than out of a desperate need for the comfort of understanding. "We should return to the house," Holmes said. "It is nearly 8 o'clock. We have little more than an hour before the light fails entirely, and I have some observations to make while there is still sufficient illumination to see the island clearly. But before we go, tell me one more thing. Has the young man, David Tremaine, ever come out at night to observe the signal? Or does he come only during daylight?" "Daylight," Cardew said. "Exclusively. He has never been here in the evening, as far as I know, which is curious because if one wants to see a signal that appears only at night, one would think to come at night." Holmes smiled slightly. It was a small expression, but Watson had learned to read it. It meant that something had clicked into place, that a piece of the puzzle had revealed itself to be related to other pieces in a way that was now becoming apparent. They walked back toward Fenwick Head as the sky continued its darkening work. The lighthouse, when they reached it again, had already begun to glow, not fully illuminated yet, but glowing in that way that structures do when they are preparing to do their work, when the light inside them is building toward the moment when it will become essential. Cardew left them to settle into a small upstairs room he had prepared, a space that was scrupulously clean, with a window that faced toward the island, with a small desk beneath that window, and a chair positioned as though someone had anticipated that guests might want to sit and watch. Watson found himself appreciating this kind of preparation. It suggested a mind that could think in advance, that could imagine another person's needs before those needs were explicitly stated. Holmes went immediately to the desk and withdrew from his bag a small leather notebook, not the case notes he carried for everyday use, but something more specialized, filled with references and cross-indexed observations. He opened it and began to write, his hand moving with a quick, efficient script that meant his mind had already begun the process of connecting things that the rest of the world had not yet noticed were related. "What are you thinking?" Watson asked, settling into a chair by the window. "I am thinking," Holmes said without looking up from his writing, "about the nature of a message that repeats itself night after night in a location that has been supposedly uninhabited for 20 years. I am thinking about a young man with a telescope who watches during the day but does not come at night. I am thinking about words that make no sense in sequence, but are deeply resonant individually. And I am thinking about what it means that the lighthouse keeper chose to write to me rather than to the local constabulary." Holmes set down his pen and turned to face Watson. The light from the window behind Watson was fading now. The sun had truly begun its descent into full darkness, and Holmes's face was half lit, contemplative. "Do you know," Holmes continued, "what the relationship between a lighthouse keeper and an island would be? Consider the geometry of the situation. A lighthouse exists to warn ships away from danger. An island is precisely the sort of danger that a lighthouse warns about. The keeper of the lighthouse, therefore, has a vested interest in knowing everything about the islands and rocks near his station. He has made it his business to observe them, to understand them, to be aware of any change in their state. You are suggesting," Watson said slowly, "that Cardew has a professional relationship with the island that makes his observations particularly credible." "More than that," Holmes said. "I am suggesting that Cardew, having spent 4 years at Fenwick Head, has surely formed opinions about that island. He knows its tides, its weather patterns, its accessibility. He knows almost certainly whether it would be possible for a man to reach it by boat, or by swimming, or by any other means. The fact that he has not mentioned this suggests that the possibility has not occurred to him as relevant, which means we must consider it relevant ourselves. Holmes rose and moved to the window. Outside, the darkness was nearly complete now. In another hour, perhaps less, the signal would come. The island would speak in its particular language, and they would be here to observe it. "Tell me about the harbour master's son," Holmes said. "Tell me everything Cardew has told you, and everything you have inferred," Watson gathered his thoughts. A young man of perhaps 18 years, educated beyond his station. He has read extensively. His mother died 8 years ago. Since then, he has seemed without direction. He takes work but does not settle. His father is a competent man, but, one assumes, conventional in his thinking. The son has recently begun taking evening walks along the cliff path, carrying a telescope. He shows interest in what can be heard from the island, not merely what can be seen. And what in all of that suggests that he is guilty of something? Nothing, Watson admitted. In fact, it suggests rather the opposite. He seems a young man groping for meaning, for purpose. Precisely, Holmes said. And yet we must consider the possibility that his apparent search for meaning is actually a cover for knowledge that he already possesses. But we also must consider the simpler possibility, that he has seen the signal, and like Cardew, he is trying to make sense of it. The question is, has anyone told him what to make of it? Has anyone directed his attention toward the island knowing what he would find there? Holmes sat back down at the desk. He withdrew another piece of paper and began to draw, not an illustration, but a kind of map. It showed the coastline, the position of the lighthouse, the location of the island, and the cliff path. He marked the spot where they had stood, the spot from which the island was most clearly visible. He marked the harbour in St. Ives, marked the position of the Tremaine house, which Cardew had mentioned was on a small rise overlooking the harbour. From the Tremaine house, Holmes said, more to himself than to Watson, one could see the harbour, one's father's work, the affairs of the town, but one could not see the island, not without coming to this cliff path, which means that David Tremaine had to deliberately come to this location, had to deliberately bring his telescope, had to deliberately position himself to observe something. That is not idle curiosity, Watson. That is purposeful action. A sound reached them from downstairs. Cardew, moving about in the kitchen, preparing something. The smell of soup began to rise through the house, something warm and sea-influenced, with the particular fragrance of fish stock and thyme. It was a comforting smell, the sort of smell that encouraged a man to believe that food and warmth and human company were things worth valuing. "Come," Holmes said, setting down his pen. "We should eat, and then, if I have calculated the timing correctly, we should position ourselves at the window to observe. The signal, if it comes tonight, will be something worth seeing. And I have a theory, Watson, that is taking shape in my mind like a photograph developing in chemical solution. Soon, it will be clear enough to test." They descended to the small dining room, where Cardew had laid out a simple meal, bread, cheese, and the soup that had been promising itself from the kitchen. There was wine, too, something local and unpretentious, that tasted of the earth and the sea and the particular quality of grapes that have learned to grow in challenging circumstances. The conversation during the meal was general. Cardew spoke about the history of the lighthouse, about the work of maintaining it, about the particular qualities of light and storm and the long stretches of solitude that were part of the keeper's life. But Watson noticed that Holmes was only partially present in the conversation. The rest of his mind was clearly engaged with the problem of the island, turning it over, examining it from different angles, looking for the thread that would unravel it. By the time they finished eating, full darkness had fallen. The windows revealed nothing but their own reflection, the warm light of the house looking back at itself from the black glass. Cardew collected the dishes, and Holmes gestured for Watson to follow him back upstairs. They took positions at the window, Holmes at the desk, Watson in the chair beside him. The night pressed against the glass, patient and complete. Somewhere out there the island was there, though it was invisible in the darkness. The sea made its sound, that rhythmic, half-articulate sound that was neither quite speech nor quite music, but something in between. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked toward 10 o'clock. "Do you know," Holmes said quietly, "what the most interesting detail in Cardew's letter was?" "The salt staining?" Watson ventured. "No, though that was indicative. The most interesting detail was the one that was absent. Cardew did not mention whether he had attempted to reach the island, whether he had considered taking a boat out to investigate. Why do you suppose that is? Watson considered this. Because it would be dangerous? Because the tides are treacherous? Possibly. Or because he has already attempted it and found something that he does not wish to discuss? Or because someone has warned him away from it? Or because he knows from his experience as a lighthouse keeper that approaching the island is less important than observing it from a distance? The island is, in a sense, part of his geography. One does not investigate one's geography, Watson. One lives within it. One learns its patterns. The clock on the mantelpiece struck 10, and then, as though the island had been waiting for the hour to arrive, the light came. It was small, faint, barely visible at first, a tiny brightness that seemed to emerge from the darkness of the island's highest point. Watson had to lean forward, had to focus his vision entirely upon that spot, in order to convince himself that he was actually seeing something, and not simply imagining that he was. "There," Holmes whispered, though there was no one to disturb. "The message begins." The light blinked. It was in a pattern, short, long, short, short. The basic geometry of Morse code, but modified, abstracted somehow, as though the person sending it was using the code as a framework, but not strictly adhering to it. The pattern repeated. A pause, then a different pattern. Another pause. A third pattern that seemed to carry more repetitions, more emphasis. It was, Watson thought, like watching someone speak in a language one did not understand but in which meaning was nonetheless perceptible. The emotion was clear, even if the words were not. There was urgency in the rhythm, but also resignation. There was something of memory in it, something of longing, something of a question that had been asked so many times that the person asking it no longer quite expected an answer. The sequences continued for perhaps 10 minutes, then gradually they slowed. The intervals between blinks became longer, the pattern became less insistent, and finally the light faded. Not suddenly, but gradually, as though someone was slowly, deliberately, drawing the lamp away, extinguishing the signal for another night. For a long moment neither Holmes nor Watson spoke. The darkness had returned to being simply darkness. The island was no longer visible at all. "Well," Holmes said at last, "that was instructive. Very instructive indeed. Did you notice, Watson, the particular way the signal was constructed, the rhythm of it?" "I noticed it was repetitive," Watson said. "But beyond that, I confess I was simply observing the phenomenon itself." "Of course you were," Holmes said, and there was gentleness in his tone. "But consider this. Whoever is sending this message is not sending it in the hope of being understood by the world at large. They are sending it in the hope of being understood by one specific person. Someone who knows the code, who knows the context, who will recognize the words being spelled out because those words have meaning for them specifically." "Cardew?" Watson asked. "Possibly, or someone else. But notice this, Watson. The message, whatever it says, is consistent. The same words appear in the same positions night after night for 6 weeks. That suggests something that has been carefully composed, carefully thought out. Not the panicked plea of a lost soul, but the deliberate message of someone with a purpose. Someone, I would say, with something to communicate and the patience to communicate it repeatedly until someone listens." Outside, the night continued. The sea continued its rhythmic conversation with itself, and in the darkness, somewhere on the island or somewhere beyond it, whoever had sent the signal settled down to wait for the next clear night, knowing that their message had been sent again, knowing that someone, whether the intended recipient or not, had been watching. Holmes turned from the window and looked at Watson. "Tomorrow," he said, "we take a boat to the island, and then, I think, we will begin to understand what has been happening here. But tonight, Watson, we sleep, and we keep to ourselves what we have seen. For if my theory is correct, knowledge of our presence here must remain secret for a little longer. There are people in this small community who would very much like to know what we think we know. And the discovery of their intentions may prove to be considerably more instructive than the discovery of the signal itself." Morning came to Fenwick Head with the kind of quiet insistence that belongs to coastal places. There was no gradual awakening. One moment there was darkness against the window, and the next there was grey light that had somehow arrived without announcing itself. Watson found himself conscious without quite remembering the process of falling asleep, which suggested that his body had decided that rest was more important than the usual transitions between wakefulness and dream. Holmes was already awake. He was at the desk, of course, but not writing. Instead, he was examining a map, a proper Ordnance Survey map of the Cornish coast, with a magnifying glass, his eyes moving with the particular intensity that meant he was looking for something specific rather than observing something general. He didn't look up as Watson rose and moved to the window, but he spoke as though Watson had entered into a conversation that had already begun. "The island has been uninhabited for approximately 20 years, Holmes said. According to Cardew, at least. But uninhabited does not mean untended. Notice the position of the old structure. It is at the highest point, true, but it is not central. It is positioned specifically to be visible from the cliff path where we stood yesterday, and from no other vantage point on the mainland that I can determine. That suggests that whoever built it, or whoever has been maintaining it, was aware of observation from that specific direction." Watson moved closer to look at the map. The island was represented in careful detail, rocks marked, depths noted, a small indication of the ruins that stood upon it. Holmes had drawn lines from the island to various points on the coast, measuring angles and distances with the precision of a man working through a geometric problem. "The harbour is here," Holmes continued, pointing to St. Ives. "The harbour master's house is approximately there. Cardew was vague, but the house would logically be on the rise overlooking the water. From that position the island would be visible but not prominent. The view would be obscured by the headland for much of the day, but from the cliff path, where David Tremayne stands with his telescope, the view is unobstructed." Which brings us to an interesting question. How did David Tremayne know to go to that specific location? Did he stumble upon it by accident, or was he directed there? There was a knock on the door, Cardew, bringing water for washing, and announcing that breakfast would be prepared within the hour. He seemed diminished in the morning light, Watson thought. The night had taken something from him, or perhaps merely revealed something that had always been there. His eyes had the particular quality of a man who has not quite slept, who has spent the night in that state of half-consciousness that comes from anticipation mixed with anxiety. "You heard it?" Holmes asked, though it was not quite a question. "I did," Cardew confirmed. "It was as I described. Did you observe anything that might help explain it?" "I observed everything," Holmes said. "But explanation is a thing that requires time and information. We will take a boat to the island this morning if the weather permits. I assume you have connections, someone who can provide a suitable vessel, and some knowledge of the tides?" "There is a man in the village," Cardew said. "Amos Fleet. He manages small boat rentals for visitors. He is reliable and discreet. I can arrange it." "Do so," Holmes said. "And Mr. Cardew, it would be advisable if news of our arrival did not reach the wider community. A consulting detective and a doctor arriving to investigate signal lights might generate considerable curiosity that we would prefer to investigate without being investigated in return." Cardew nodded slowly. There was something in his expression that suggested both relief and resignation, as though he had been hoping for precisely this secrecy, but had also been afraid to ask for it. Breakfast was a quiet affair. The three men ate porridge and bread and drank strong tea, while the morning light gradually asserted itself over the grey half-light of dawn. Outside the window, the sea was in a cooperative mood, not calm precisely, but not aggressive. The wind was moderate, carrying the particular scent of low tide, that smell of exposed rock and seaweed, and the particular mineral quality of water that has been recently revealed. By 9 o'clock Cardew had arranged the boat. Amos Fleet was a man of perhaps 70 years, with the weathered aspect of someone who had spent his entire life in negotiations with the sea. His boat was a practical thing, open, with a small cabin forward, and a modest sail that was clearly meant for short distances rather than ambitious voyages. He did not ask questions, which Watson appreciated. He simply accepted payment, checked the wind and tide, and gestured them aboard. The journey to the island took perhaps 20 minutes. It was during this journey that Watson became acutely aware of how small the island actually was. From the shore, it had seemed to have a kind of commanding presence, looming, isolated, significant. But from the water, it resolved into something considerably more modest, a rocky protrusion, a handful of acres at most, crowned with the structure that Cardew had described. Holmes stood at the bow watching the island approach. His face was thoughtful, his eyes moving constantly, cataloguing every detail. Watson found himself doing the same, noting the quality of the rock, the particular angle of the structure, the way the water moved around the island's edges, creating small whirlpools and eddies that suggested complex currents. "The rocks are unstable," Amos called from the stern where he was managing the sail. "Loose. The whole thing is eroding. Another 50 years and there will be nothing but a navigational hazard." "How long has the structure been standing?" Holmes asked. "The ruin? Older than I am. And I've never been young. There are stories, old stories, about it being a hermit's cell or maybe a shepherd's shelter. Something built centuries ago when the island was worth something to someone. Now it's just a place the seabirds use." They approached as close as the rocks would allow. Amos held the boat steady with practiced ease, positioning it in a small cove where the water was deeper and the landing theoretically possible. The structure stood above them, perhaps 30 feet up the slope of the island, accessible by what looked as though it might once have been a path but now resembled merely a particular way that stones had chosen to arrange themselves. Holmes was over the side and onto the rocks with the kind of physical certainty that Watson had seen many times, but which always surprised him slightly. The consulting detective was not an athletic man, and yet when investigation required climbing or swimming, or any other physical exertion, he seemed to possess a kind of intuitive grace. Watson followed more carefully, his leg, the old wound from Afghanistan, being less inclined to cooperate with sudden demands for agility. The climb to the structure was more difficult than it appeared from below. The rocks were loose, as Amos had mentioned, and the wind that had seemed moderate from the boat was considerably more insistent when one was standing in it, attempting to maintain balance while ascending. But Holmes seemed hardly to notice either obstacle. He moved with the kind of focused attention that meant his mind was already interpreting what his eyes were seeing. The structure, when they reached it, was smaller than Watson had expected. It was perhaps 12 feet across, with walls that rose to perhaps 8 feet at their highest point. The roof had long since collapsed, leaving only the stone frames of what might once have been a door and a window. The interior was open to the sky, filled with rubble and the accumulation of decades, broken pottery, fragments of wood, the detritus of abandonment. But it was not this accumulation that drew Holmes's attention. He moved immediately to the corner of the structure, where the stone was fresher, less weathered than the rest. He knelt, examining something on the ground, something that Watson could not quite see from where he stood. "Come here," Holmes said, "but do not step directly on the ground, keep to the edges. The evidence here is recent, and I would prefer not to disturb it unnecessarily." Watson moved carefully to Holmes's position. What he saw made his breath catch slightly. It was a fire, or rather the remains of a fire. It was recent enough that the charcoal was still black, still held the structure of wood that had been carefully arranged and then burned. There were bones in it, animal bones definitely, the remains of something that had been prepared and cooked. And beside the fire pit, arranged carefully, was a collection of items: a battered tin cup, a spoon, a length of rope, and, most peculiarly, a logbook of some kind, wrapped in what appeared to be oilcloth. Holmes opened the logbook with the kind of care one shows when handling something fragile. The pages were handwritten, the ink faded but still legible. He read the first page silently, his expression shifting as he did so, a complex progression of emotions moving across his features like clouds across a sky. "Read it," he said, handing the notebook to Watson. Watson took it. The handwriting was tremulous, aging, the script of a man whose hands were no longer entirely steady. The first entry was dated to approximately 6 weeks previous, roughly the time that Cardew had first observed the signal. "To whoever reads this," Watson read aloud, "if anyone ever reads this. My name is Thomas Whitmore, and I've been a sailor for 50 years. I've sailed ships, managed crews, survived storms that should have killed me, and would have, had I been a different kind of man. But I've never been a different kind of man, so here I stand, 73 years old, living on an island that no one remembers, sending signals that no one understands, waiting for a response that I know will never come. But I send them anyway, because the alternative to hoping is simply to stop, and I have not yet learned how to stop." Holmes took the notebook back and continued reading silently. Watson watched his face, watching the reactions that moved across it. When Holmes finished, he looked up toward the sea, toward the distant line where water became sky became weather. "We have found our signal," Holmes said quietly. "Or rather, we have found the man who sends it. The question now is considerably more complicated. The question is, why?" Watson moved to examine the rest of the shelter's contents. The rope was new, relatively speaking, probably no more than a few years old. The tin cup bore marks of heavy use. There was a small pile of books in one corner, protected by another layer of oilcloth. Watson withdrew one, a volume of poetry, Keats, with passages marked and annotated in the same tremulous handwriting as the log. "He has been living here longer than 6 weeks," Watson said. "The rope, the cup, the books, these suggest extended habitation." "Years, I would estimate," Holmes replied. "The fire is recent, true, but the stone of the shelter shows evidence of long-term occupation. Small marks where nails have been driven in and removed, repeated, patches of soot that suggest a stove or brazier that was used regularly, then removed. This man has been on this island for a considerable time. The signal is recent, but the residence is not." Holmes stood and moved to examine the walls more closely. He ran his fingers along the stone, paused at certain points, seemingly reading the history of the structure from its physical composition. His eye moved over every surface, every mark, every irregularity. "There," Holmes said, pointing to a section of wall where the stone seemed deliberately arranged. Water was being collected. This pattern of stones would channel water from the roof, when there was a roof, into a container, and here the mark suggests someone has been grinding something, seeds perhaps, or dried leaves for tea. This man has not merely been existing here, Watson. He has been living deliberately, consciously, making the best of an impossible situation. They found, as they continued their examination, the remains of what had once been a more complete dwelling. In a sheltered corner, there were the rotted remains of a sleeping platform, constructed from driftwood and secured with rope. There were the remnants of a small distillery, arrangement, flasks and bottles, some empty, some still containing liquid. There were fishing implements, hooks, lines, nets that had been carefully maintained and repaired numerous times. But it was in a recess of the wall, a natural cavity in the stone, that they found the most significant discovery. Holmes reached in carefully and withdrew a small metal box, the kind used for storing valuables. Inside, wrapped in cloth that might once have been white, but was now yellowed with age, was a collection of letters. Holmes opened them with extreme care. The first was addressed to Tom, in handwriting that was not the same as the logbook's script. It was older, bolder, more confident. The signature at the bottom read, "Always yours, James." "A letter," Holmes said slowly, "to Thomas Whitmore, from someone named James, dated approximately 22 years ago." There were others, 3 more letters, all from the same person, all addressed to Tom, all dated within a span of 6 months, approximately 22 years in the past. Holmes read them silently, and Watson, watching his face, saw something that he rarely saw, profound sadness moving across Holmes's features. When Holmes finally spoke, his voice was softer than Watson had ever heard it. "James was his name," Holmes said, "or at least James was the person he loved. These letters describe a separation, a forced parting. The tone suggests that they were unable to remain together in England, that the law or society or both made their relationship impossible. The final letter, this one, suggests that James was being sent to Australia. There is a line here. 'I will not forget you, not in this life or the next. Keep yourself safe. When the world is ready, perhaps we will find each other again. But if we do not, know that every moment with you was worth the cost of this parting.'" Holmes set the letters down with the kind of care one shows when placing something breakable. "Thomas Whitmore came to this island," Holmes continued, "and has remained here for more than 20 years. He came here after the loss of the person he loved, and recently, very recently, he has begun to signal. Night after night, the same message. Not in hope of being understood by the world, but in hope of being understood by one person, or perhaps in hope that the world might finally be ready to understand what it was that cost him everything." Watson felt something shift in his understanding of the situation. What had seemed like a mystery, a puzzle to be solved, had suddenly become something considerably more human. It became, in that moment, a tragedy. The signal was not a crime, not a deception. It was a man calling out across the darkness, using the only language he possessed, attempting to make himself heard after decades of silence. "The words," Watson said slowly, "sail, deep, rock, home. They must mean something. Of course they do, Holmes said. He had picked up the logbook again and was examining the entries more closely. Look here. The first sequence of the signal includes the word sail repeated 3 times. The second includes deep once and rock twice. The third ends with home. It is not Morse code at all, not precisely. It is something older. It is semaphore, Watson. Or rather, it is an adaptation of semaphore translated into light. Our Thomas Whitmore is using the language of the sea, the language he has known all his life. Holmes moved to the edge of the island, looking back toward the mainland. From this distance, the cliff path was barely visible, a thin line of distinction between rock and grass, but from the shelter, positioned at the highest point, it would be clearly visible. Someone standing here and sending a signal would be directing that signal toward one specific location, the place where David Tremayne stood with his telescope. But there is still the matter of David Tremayne, Watson said. If the signal is meant for James, who is presumably in Australia by now, dead or departed from this world entirely, then why would the young man be watching? Why would he bring a telescope? That, Holmes said, is the question that remains, and it is, I think, considerably more complex than a simple case of signal and sender. There is someone in this community who knows about Thomas Whitmore, someone who has been watching him, maintaining awareness of his situation, someone who perhaps has even been bringing him supplies. As if in answer to this speculation, Holmes's eye was drawn to something at the base of the shelter, a tin relatively new containing supplies, hardtack biscuits, dried fish, salt. It was carefully hidden, positioned as though someone had deliberately left it there, had expected it to be found. Someone has been leaving supplies, Watson said. Yes, Holmes agreed, and recently. These supplies are no more than a week old. Someone knows that Thomas Whitmore is here. Someone cares enough about his survival to ensure that he is provisioned, and that someone, I would suggest, is the harbour master's son. The pieces began to assemble themselves in Watson's mind. David Tremayne, watching with his telescope from the cliff path. David Tremayne, asking pointed questions about the island, about what could be heard from it. David Tremayne, who had taken to walking on clear nights, not to observe the signal, but to deliver supplies after darkness had fallen, when his activities would be less likely to be noted. But how would David Tremayne know about Whitmore? Watson asked. How would a young man of 18 know about a sailor who has been living on this island for decades? That, Holmes said, is what we must discover, and I suspect the answer lies not on this island, but on the mainland. We must speak with the harbour master. We must understand the connection between Marcus Tremayne and Thomas Whitmore. There is a thread here, Watson, and when we pull it, I suspect a considerable tapestry will unravel. They gathered the logbook and the letters, securing them carefully. Holmes left the supplies where they were. There was no point in disturbing them. They descended from the island with the same care they had ascended, and returned to the boat where Amos waited, seemingly unsurprised by their emergence from the shelter. "Find anything interesting?" Amos asked as they settled into the boat. "Yes," Holmes said simply. "We found a ghost, I think. Or rather, we found a man who has been living as though he were a ghost. The question now is what to do about it." The return journey to the shore seemed to take longer than the outbound journey had. Watson found himself thinking about Thomas Whitmore, a man of 73 years, living alone on an island, sending signals night after night in a code that no one understood, waiting for a response that would never come. There was something profoundly moving about it, but also something profoundly sad. The romance of a great love that had been impossible, a love so powerful that it had driven a man to exile himself from the world. When they reached Fenwick Head, Cardew was waiting at the shore. His face showed the strain of a man who had been waiting, who had been imagining what might be happening on the island, what might be being discovered. "Tell him," Holmes said to Watson as they made their way back to the house, and so Watson did. He told Cardew about Thomas Whitmore, about the shelter, about the letters and the logbook. He watched as Cardew's expression shifted from concern to understanding to a kind of compassionate sadness. 22 years, Cardew said quietly. "He has been here for 22 years. Good God, I did not know. I would have helped him. I would have—" "You did not know because he did not wish you to know," Holmes said gently. "But tell me, Mr. Cardew, You are a man who has spent 30 years in the maritime service. You would know the history of your coast, the people associated with it. Did you know Thomas Whitmore before he came to this island?" Cardew was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. "He was a good sailor," Cardew said. "Better than good. He was exceptional. He captained ships, managed crews. I knew him, yes. Not well, but I knew him. He disappeared, perhaps 22 years ago. There was some scandal attached to it. I never understood the details, but he simply left, abandoned his career. There were rumours, but I paid them no attention." "The rumours were about his friendship with another sailor," Holmes said. "A man named James. A friendship that was considerably more than friendship. It was the kind of connection that 22 years ago could cost a man everything." Cardew closed his eyes. "Yes," he said quietly. "Yes, I remember now. There was such a rumour. The man was sent away, I believe. Australia, I think. And Whitmore simply vanished. I assumed he had followed, or killed himself, or simply gone mad with grief. But he came here. He came to this island and made a life for himself, as much as one can make a life living alone on a rock in the sea." "He came here," Holmes said, "because the island sits within view of the mainland, but isolated enough that no one would think to look. And he has remained because remaining is its own form of devotion. But recently something has changed. Recently he has begun to signal, and someone has begun to watch and to care for him. That someone, I believe, is the harbour master's son, and the story of why David Tremaine cares about a stranger who has lived on an island for decades. That, Mr. Cardew, is the story we must now solve." The village of St. Ives revealed itself gradually as they descended from Fenwick Head. It was the kind of place that had learned, over centuries, to exist in conversation with the sea, not fighting it, not exactly submitting to it, but rather negotiating with it on a daily basis. The harbour was modest but well maintained, with fishing boats arranged in a careful order that spoke of a community organised around the work of the water. The harbour master's house stood on a rise overlooking this arrangement, a stone building of respectable size with windows that faced the harbour, like eyes watching for weather, for danger, for the small emergencies that arise when men work on water. It was nearly 3:00 when Holmes and Watson made their way to the house, leaving Cardew at Fenwick Head with instructions to observe the evening light and note any variations from the previous night's signal. The walk took them through the village proper, narrow streets, shops with salt-stained windows, the particular atmosphere of a place where fish smell had become so permanent a feature that it ceased to be noticed and became instead merely the smell of home. The harbour master's house was answered by a woman, a housekeeper, Watson assumed, though she might have been family. She was perhaps 50 years old, with the kind of face that suggested she had once been beautiful and had made peace with the fact that beauty was no longer her business. She showed them to a waiting room without asking their business, which suggested either that visitors to the harbour master were common enough not to warrant explanation, or that the woman had learned not to ask questions about people who arrived with the kind of quiet authority that both Holmes and Watson possessed. Marcus Tremaine emerged after only a few minutes. He was a man of perhaps 60, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, and the weathered appearance of someone who has spent a lifetime in the company of the wind and water. His face was square, decisive, the kind of face that made decisions and stood by them. But there was something else in his expression as well, a weariness perhaps, or a weight that had nothing to do with years or weather. "Mr. Holmes," he said, and his tone suggested that he had been expecting them, or at least that their appearance was not a complete surprise. "I assume you have come from Fenwick Head. I assume Malcolm Cardew has told you about the signal. I assume you have gone to the island and found what there is to find." It was not a question, and Holmes did not treat it as one. Instead, he simply inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement. "You know about Thomas Whitmore," Holmes said. It was not a question either. Marcus Tremaine gestured them toward chairs. He settled himself into a larger chair positioned to face them, his posture suggesting a man preparing himself for a difficult conversation. "I know about him," Tremaine said slowly. "Yes, I have known about him for some time. Not all the time, not when he first came to the island. That was before I became harbour master. But once I took this position, once I began to understand the tides and the movements around my harbour, I realised that someone was living on that island It took time to confirm it. It took longer still to understand why. "Your son knows," Watson said. It was not a question either. "My son knows," Tremaine confirmed. "He knows because I told him, and I told him because I could no longer bear to know alone. Do you understand what it means, to know that a man is living alone on a rock in the sea, and to do nothing about it? To see his ship, his own ship, the one he captained for years, converted to fishing use and working out of another port, and to know that the man who commanded it is exiled, is suffering, is dying slowly of a loneliness that has been imposed upon him by a world that cannot accept what he is." Holmes regarded Tremaine with the kind of attention he usually reserved for criminals or particularly complex puzzles. "You knew him," Holmes said, "before the exile. You were a sailor then, I would imagine. You knew the rumours about Whitmore and the man named James." "I knew more than rumours," Tremaine said. "I knew the truth. I was on Whitmore's ship for 3 years. I served under him as mate, and I watched what was between him and James, the second mate, with the kind of understanding that comes from being young enough not to have learned yet that such things were supposed to be shameful. I simply knew that I was watching 2 men who loved each other, and I knew that they were good men, and that the love between them was not a weakness but a kind of strength. When the scandal came, when the authorities began to move against them, I was young enough to be powerless and old enough to be ashamed of my powerlessness." Tremaine stood and moved to the window that overlooked the harbour. His hands, Watson noticed, were gripping the window frame with considerable force. "James was sent to Australia," Tremaine continued. "There was to be transportation, a fresh start, a way of separating them. Whitmore was told that if he did not resign from his position and disappear, there would be charges pressed. There would be trial, imprisonment, the complete and utter destruction of everything he had built. So he chose exile instead. He chose to disappear rather than face the machinery of the law that had decided he was unfit to exist in polite society. And you," Holmes said quietly, maintained awareness of him. "I became harbour master here approximately 20 years ago," Tremaine said. "I took this position specifically because it gave me access to the area where I believed Whitmore might be hiding. I began to monitor the island. I began to understand the patterns of his presence there. And when my wife died, 8 years ago, and I found myself alone with my son, I made a decision. I decided that David should know the truth. Not to burden him, but to teach him something. To teach him that some people are worth caring for, even if the world has decided they are not worth saving." Watson felt something move in his chest, a complicated mixture of admiration and sorrow. Here was a man who had spent decades maintaining a secret, maintaining a connection to another human being who the world had decided was disposable. "Your son has been leaving supplies," Holmes said. It was not a question. "Yes," Tremaine confirmed, "for the past 2 years. At first I was going myself, but my health began to decline. I have a weakness in my heart, nothing that kills me quickly, but something that limits my activities. So I told David. I told him everything. I told him about Whitmore, about James, about the long years of exile. And David, who is a better man than I am, decided that he would help. He began to leave supplies at regular intervals. He began to watch the signal at night, not because he understood it, but because it meant that Whitmore was still alive, still aware, still sending his message to a world that he hoped might someday listen." Holmes returned to his chair. He sat with his fingers steepled together, his eyes focused on something middle distance, something that existed only in his own mind. "There is a question," Holmes said, "that requires answering. The signal that Whitmore is sending, the words that repeat each night, what do they mean? Because they are not random, and they are not a simple call for help. They are specific. They are deliberate. What is Thomas Whitmore trying to say?" Tremaine was quiet for a long moment. Then he rose again and moved to a drawer in his desk. From it he withdrew a piece of paper. A letter, Watson saw, as Tremaine handed it to Holmes. It was written in the same tremulous handwriting as the logbook on the island. Holmes read it silently. His expression did not change, but Watson had learned to read the small signs in Holmes's face, the minute tightening around the eyes, the subtle shift in his breathing. These signs meant that what he was reading was affecting him more deeply than his outward demeanour suggested. "How did you obtain this?" Holmes asked when he had finished reading. "David brought it to me," Tremaine said, "approximately 3 months ago. Whitmore entrusted it to David during one of the supply deliveries. He has been preparing this letter for some time. He has been preparing many things. He has been making peace with his life, I think. while simultaneously attempting to make peace with the world that exiled him. Holmes handed the letter to Watson. It was addressed to no one in particular, or perhaps to everyone in general. It began, "To the world that cast me out, and to James, wherever you may be in this world or the next. I have lived on this island for 22 years. I have lived in solitude, in exile, in a state of existence that the law deemed appropriate for men like me. I have grown old here. I have watched the sea change with the seasons. I have learned to find meaning in small things. The particular way light falls on water at dawn, the sound of gulls crying, the taste of fish that I catch myself, the warmth of a fire in a shelter that has become my entire world. But I have also learned something else. I have learned that solitude does not erase what you were before the solitude. I was a sailor. I was a man who commanded ships and crews. I was a man who loved another man with the kind of love that the world has decided should not exist. All of these things are still true. They are true here on this island. They are true whether anyone knows them or not. I have begun to signal. Each night, I send the same message in the language I know best. The language of the sea, the language of Morse and semaphore and the old signals that sailors used when the world was younger and less certain of itself. The message is this: sail, because you sailed away from me, James, and because I have spent my entire life sailing, and that will never change. Deep, because the distance between us is deep, because the ocean is deep, because the past is deep and cannot be changed no matter how much I might wish it. Rock, because I am on a rock, because I have become hard like a rock, because the foundation of my life is now stone and sea instead of ships and love. Home, because this island has become my home, and I accept it, and I no longer rage against it, and I have made peace with the fact that home is not always the place you wish to be, but sometimes only the place where you have learned to survive. I send these words each night in hope of what? I do not know. Hope that the world has changed. Hope that someone is listening. Hope that James, somewhere, knows that I have not forgotten, that I have not stopped loving him, that my exile has not extinguished what was between us. But I think I also send these words because I have discovered something in my years alone. I have discovered that even when the world has cast you out, even when you have been deemed unfit for society, you can still make meaning. You can still speak. You can still be heard, even if only by a few, and perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that has always been enough, and I was simply too young and too wounded to understand it. My name is Thomas Whitmore. I was a sailor. I loved a man named James with all that I was and all that I had and all that I might have been. I have lived in exile for this love, and I do not regret it. In a world that told me that I should regret it, I have found the strength to say that I do not. And if that is all I leave behind when I am gone, if that is the only thing I manage to accomplish in these years of solitude, then I think I will have accomplished something worth accomplishing. To whoever reads this, the world is not kind to people like us, but we exist nonetheless. We love nonetheless. We matter nonetheless. Remember that. Please remember that. Watson lowered the letter. He found that his hands were shaking slightly, and he made an effort to control them. There was something in the words, something in the raw honesty of them, the lack of self-pity combined with a complete refusal to apologize for who he was, that moved him profoundly. "When did he write this?" Watson asked quietly. "Approximately a year ago," Tremaine said. "He has had it for some time, waiting for the right moment to entrust it to David, but he has also been preparing other things. He has been preparing his own ending, I think, not through violence or despair, but through acceptance. He is an old man, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. He has lived longer than he expected to live, and he is ready for the story to end, I think, though he is not yet ready to write the ending himself." "Why did he begin the signal only recently?" Holmes asked. "Because he received a letter," Tremaine said. "A letter that reached him through channels I still do not fully understand. A letter from Australia, from James." The silence that followed this revelation was absolute. Outside, the harbour continued its small activities, boats moving, men working, the ordinary business of commerce and survival. But in this room, time seemed to have stopped. "James is alive," Holmes said. It was not a question. James is alive, Tremaine confirmed. He has been in Australia all these years. He became a successful man there, a businessman, I believe, involved in shipping. He built a life. He married, had children, became respectable in a way that he could never have become here. And then, approximately 6 months ago, his wife died. And he began to think about his past. He began to think about Whitmore, and he wrote a letter. What did the letter say? Holmes asked. I do not know the full contents, Tremaine said. David would not tell me. He said Whitmore had asked for the letter to remain private. But I know that it reached Whitmore somehow, through maritime channels, through the network of sailors who have always had a way of communicating across distance. And after Whitmore received it, he began the signal. He began sending his message into the night, not in despair, but in hope. He has discovered that the person he loved did not forget, that across 22 years and the distance of an ocean, the love was remembered, and that has given him permission to speak at last. Watson found himself understanding in that moment what the signal truly was. It was not a cry for help. It was not a message of desperation. It was a declaration. It was a man who had lived in silence for decades, finally deciding that he had the right to speak. It was an old sailor, in exile, on an island, sending his love across the darkness in the only language he possessed. There is a complication, Holmes said after a long moment. The signal has been observed. Cardew observed it. You and your son observe it. But there may be others who have also observed it. Others who may not understand its true nature and may interpret it as something threatening, or dangerous, or worthy of investigation by authorities that would prefer such things to remain hidden. Tremaine's face darkened. You believe someone else knows? I believe it is possible, Holmes said carefully. The signal is not invisible. It appears nightly. In a small community, unusual occurrences have a way of becoming known, and there may be individuals in this community who have beliefs about what such a signal might mean, beliefs that would lead them to take action. What action? Tremaine asked, and there was fear in his voice now. That remains to be determined, Holmes said. But I think it would be prudent to accelerate our investigation. I think it would be wise to understand who else is aware of the signal, and what their intentions might be regarding it. And I think we should prepare for the possibility that Thomas Whitmore's years of exile may be moving toward a conclusion, not through his own choice, but through external circumstances that are no longer within his control. Holmes stood, and Watson recognized in his posture the particular readiness that indicated the consulting detective was preparing to take action. Your son, Holmes said to Tremaine. I would like to speak with him. I would like to understand what he has learned from his interactions with Whitmore, and what his intentions are regarding the man's future. David works at the harbour, Tremaine said. He should be finishing his shift soon. We can wait for him if you wish, or I can send for him. We will wait, Holmes said. And while we wait, I would like to examine any correspondence you have received that might relate to the signal, to the island, or to unusual occurrences in the area. There may be something that you have not recognised as significant, but which might prove to be considerable importance. Tremaine nodded slowly. He seemed, Watson thought, to have settled into a state of resignation. He had kept his secret for a long time, but the secret was no longer entirely his to keep. Others now knew, and with that knowing came responsibility, and the possibility of consequences that he could not control. David Tremaine arrived as the afternoon was transitioning into evening. He was a young man of perhaps 18, as Cardew's description had implied, but he seemed older than his years. There was a seriousness in his expression, a weight of awareness that suggested he had spent his young adulthood thinking about things that should not have required such thought. He wore the clothes of a working man, practical, worn, bearing the marks of honest labour, but his hands, Watson noticed, were more refined than those of a dock worker. They were a reader's hands, a thinking man's hands. Father, David said, and then he saw Holmes and Watson, and his demeanour shifted to something more guarded. Gentlemen, this is Mr. Sherlock Holmes, Tremaine said, and Dr. John Watson. They have come from London to investigate the signal. They have been to the island. They have found Thomas Whitmore. For a moment David appeared to stop breathing. His face went pale, and he steadied himself against the nearest chair. Is he? David began, and then could not finish the question. He is alive, Holmes said gently. He is well provisioned, thanks to your efforts. He is living as completely as a man in his circumstances can. But he is also a man of 73 years living in isolation, and that creates certain vulnerabilities. David moved to a chair and sat without being invited. His hands, Watson noticed, were trembling. "He is my grandfather," David said quietly. "Thomas Whitmore is my grandfather." The statement hung in the air like something tangible, something that required a moment to solidify into understanding. "Explain," Holmes said, and there was nothing but genuine interest in his voice. "James was my grandfather," David continued. "My mother's father. No one spoke of him. He was dead before I was born. But I found letters when I was going through my mother's things after she died. Letters from Thomas Whitmore, written in the years after James left England. Letters telling James of his exile, his isolation, his continuing love. And James kept those letters. He read them until they were worn through, and my mother kept them after James died, and I found them." David's voice was steady now, though tears were moving down his face. "My mother was born in Australia. James was already married by then, trying to build a life, trying to forget. My mother grew up not knowing her father's true nature, not knowing why he was sometimes sad beyond explanation, not knowing that he had left someone behind in England who was living in exile for the love that they had shared." "When did James write to Whitmore?" Holmes asked. "After my grandmother died," David said. "About 6 months ago. My grandfather, James, was clearing out some of her things, and he found the letters from Whitmore. He found them, and he read them, and he realized that all these years he had the opportunity to reach out, and he had not done so, because he was afraid. He was afraid of the pain it would cause, afraid of the past it would open, afraid that Whitmore had forgotten or had learned to hate him. So he wrote a letter. He wrote a letter telling Whitmore that he had not forgotten, that he had carried the love with him all these years, that he was proud of the man Whitmore had been, and was proud of the exile he had endured rather than submit to a world that sought to erase him." "And you?" Holmes asked, looking at David. "How did you come to know this? How did you come to care for a grandfather you had never met?" "Because," David said, "my mother kept the letters. She read them to me when I was old enough to understand. She told me about the exile, about the love, about the courage it took to live as Thomas Whitmore lived. She told me that sometimes the world is wrong, and sometimes being right in defiance of the world's wrongness is the most important thing a person can do. She told me that if I ever had the opportunity to help Thomas Whitmore, I should take it. And when my father told me that Whitmore was living on the island, I knew what I had to do." Watson felt something break open inside himself. Some part that had learned to protect itself against sentiment now suddenly unable to maintain its guard. Here was a young man, caring for an old man he had never met, driven by nothing but a sense of obligation to the dead, to the past, to the preservation of a love story that the world had done everything in its power to erase. "The signal," Holmes said, "is Whitmore's way of responding to James's letter. He is sending his message into the night in hope that somehow James will hear it, will understand it, will know that the love was reciprocated, that the exile was endured with purpose, that none of it was wasted." "But James cannot hear the signal," David said. "James is in Australia. The signal cannot reach him." "No," Holmes said. "But you can carry it to him, cannot you? You can take the translation of the signal, the meaning of the words, the knowledge that after all these years, Thomas Whitmore is alive and still loving, and you can carry that knowledge back to James. You can give him the gift of knowing that his letter was received, that it mattered, that it changed everything for the man who received it." David looked up at Holmes with an expression of such hope and longing that Watson found himself looking away, as though witnessing something too private, too raw, to be properly observed. "Could I?" David asked. "Could I truly carry that message to him?" "More than that," Holmes said. "I believe you could carry Thomas Whitmore himself. I believe that if the authorities do not interfere, if the world does not reassert its claim to these two men and their exile, there is a possibility, however slim, that they might find their way back to each other, that an old love, interrupted by time and geography and the cruelty of a world that could not accept it, might find a way to resolution." The room was quiet except for the sound of David's breathing, the sound of his struggle to contain emotions that seemed too large for one young man to hold. "There is still a danger," Holmes said, turning to Marcus Tremaine. "There is still the possibility that someone in this community will interfere, someone who has seen the signal and interpreted it as dangerous, someone who may take action to stop it. We must prepare for that possibility. We must be ready to move quickly, to protect Whitmore, to ensure his safety if it should be threatened. "What do you propose?" Tremaine asked. "I propose," Holmes said slowly, "that we observe one more night, that we watch for the signal, and that we observe carefully to see if anyone else takes notice of it. And if that observation reveals a threat, then we act. Then we remove Thomas Whitmore from the island, establish him somewhere safe, and begin the process of arranging his passage to Australia. He has lived in exile long enough. It is time for his exile to end." The evening fell around them as they continued to speak. Details and plans, logistics and possibilities. Outside, the harbour grew dark, the boats becoming shapes against the water, the sky shifting from grey to the particular blue-black of late evening. And somewhere, on an island 2 miles offshore, an old man was preparing to send his signal again, unaware that his message had finally been received, that the love he had preserved in silence was about to be answered, that the exile he had endured with such quiet dignity was approaching its end. The three of them, Holmes, Watson, and David Tremaine, returned to Fenwick Head as the light was fading from the sky. Marcus Tremaine had wanted to accompany them, but Holmes had insisted that the harbour master remain in the village, maintain his normal routine, avoid any appearance of unusual activity that might draw attention. The consulting detective was thinking several moves ahead. Watson had learned long ago, and those moves rarely included unnecessary complications. Cardew met them at the lighthouse with tea that had grown lukewarm while waiting, and an expression that suggested he had spent the afternoon in the kind of anxious thought that comes from knowing something important is about to occur, but being unable to control what form that occurrence will take. "There has been no disturbance," Cardew said. "No unusual activity. The weather remains favourable for observation. If the pattern holds, the signal should appear between 10 and past. "It will appear," Holmes said with certainty. He was standing at the window again, looking out toward the island, his hands clasped behind his back in the posture Watson had come to recognise as the posture of a mind working through complex geometry. "It will appear because Thomas Whitmore does not know that his secret has been discovered. It will appear because hope, once ignited, is difficult to extinguish. It will appear because, somewhere in Australia, an old man has begun to believe that the love of his youth might not have been entirely forgotten." David had moved to stand beside Holmes at the window. There was something in his posture that suggested the young man was seeing the island in an entirely new way now, not as a place of exile, but as a place where his family's past had lived, where the story of two men's love had been preserved in solitude and silence. "Will he know?" David asked quietly. "When he sends the signal tonight, will he somehow know that the message has been received?" That James responded. "I do not believe in premonition," Holmes said, "but I do believe in the particular quality of hope when it is given even the smallest reason to believe in itself. Thomas Whitmore has been sending his signal for 6 weeks. Tonight, when he sends it, he will do so with slightly more strength, slightly more certainty, because he will have received your father's letter by now. He will know that someone on the mainland is aware of him, is watching, is caring. That knowledge will change the quality of his signal, even if his hands remain the same, his lamp remains the same, his words remain the same." The hours passed with the particular slowness that comes when one is waiting for a specific event. They took dinner, a simple meal that Cardew prepared with the kind of efficiency that suggested he had done this many times before, had learned to operate a household on the principle that activity keeps anxiety at bay. They spoke little, and when they did speak, the conversation was desultory, touching on unimportant things: the weather forecast, the quality of the fish, the particular politics of lighthouse maintenance. But as the hour of 10 approached, the atmosphere in the sitting room shifted. It became focused, concentrated, as though everyone present was drawing their attention inward, preparing themselves for something that mattered in ways that went beyond simple observation. Holmes had arranged the room carefully. He had positioned chairs at the window, had ensured that the lamp in the room could be dimmed to allow for better observation of the darkness outside, had even positioned a small telescope, borrowed from Cardew's collection, so that closer observation of the island would be possible. Everything was prepared, methodical, precise. It was, Watson thought, the preparation of a man who understood that what was about to unfold was not merely a mystery to be solved, but a moment of human significance that deserved to be witnessed with proper attention. At exactly 10 o'clock, the light appeared, It came suddenly, as it had the previous night, a small brightness emerging from the darkness of the island's highest point. But there was something different about it, something that Watson's trained eye caught immediately and looked toward Holmes to confirm. The light was brighter, not dramatically so, but noticeably. It was as though the person holding the lamp had decided this night to hold it higher, to let it shine more fully. The signal began, ... dash. The rhythm was the same as before, the pattern familiar, the message composed of the same words that Cardew had been translating for 6 weeks. Sail, deep, rock, home. The words repeated, building upon each other, creating a kind of incantation, a prayer in the language of light. But then something changed. The pattern altered. The words that had been repeating in the same sequence suddenly began to form new combinations. New words emerged in the light. Watson heard Holmes inhale sharply, heard Cardew make a small sound of surprise. "He is responding," Holmes said quietly. "Whitmore is not simply sending his standard message. He is sending a response to the letter he received. He is answering James." The light continued, and now David was at the telescope, watching the movements of Whitmore's hand as he manipulated the lamp, watching the old sailor communicate across the darkness with a precision and control that spoke of decades of experience. The signal became longer, more complex, sequences that extended beyond the simple repetition of the previous nights. Watson found himself gripping the arms of his chair. There was something profoundly moving about what he was witnessing. An old man, in exile, finally finding his voice after years of silence, finally being able to say the things that had accumulated in his solitude. The signal was not just words. It was grief. It was love. It was the entire accumulated weight of a life lived in hiding. "Can you translate?" Watson asked Cardew. "It is difficult," Cardew said. "The sequences are not following the standard pattern. But I can make out words. James. Over and over the name appears, and then, I think, I remember, I love, I wait. The words are becoming more emotional, less controlled, as though the person sending them is losing the ability to maintain composure." The signal continued for nearly 20 minutes, far longer than any of the previous night's transmissions, and then gradually it began to slow. The rhythm that had been rapid and urgent became measured and deliberate. The light that had been bright began to dim, as though the person holding it was slowly, reluctantly lowering it. The final sequence came through, the familiar sail, deep rock home, and then the light faded entirely, leaving only darkness. The island was invisible again. The message had been sent. The connection that had been established across the darkness was broken. For a long moment, no one spoke. The room was silent except for the sound of breathing, the tick of the clock on the mantelpiece, the distant sound of the sea working against the rocks below the lighthouse. "He knows," David said, his voice barely audible. "He knows that someone heard him. He knows that the message was received." "More than that," Holmes said. "He knows that James is alive. He knows that the letter his lover sent reached him. He knows that the exile ended not with forgetting, but with remembrance. That is what changed tonight, Watson. That is why the signal was different. Thomas Whitmore has been given permission to hope, and hope, as I have often observed, is the most powerful force in human existence." But the moment of revelation was interrupted by a sound from below, a sharp knock on the door, the kind of knock that carries urgency and authority in equal measure. Cardew rose immediately, his face registering surprise and concern. "I will answer it," he said, and descended the stairs. The voices that followed were indistinct, but their tone was unmistakable. There was anger in them. There was accusation. There was the particular quality of confrontation that arises when people believe they have a right to make demands of one another. Holmes stood and moved toward the top of the stairs, Watson following. Below, in the entrance hall, they could see Cardew engaged in conversation with 2 men. One was a constable. His uniform was visible even from the distance. The other was a civilian, a man of perhaps 50 years, with the bearing of someone accustomed to respect and authority. His face was flushed with anger. "I want to know what is happening," the civilian was saying. His accent marked him as not entirely local, though his manner suggested someone who had lived in the area long enough to believe himself entitled to answers. "There have been disturbances, lights on the island, signals of some kind. And now there are strangers at the lighthouse, and the harbour master's son has been acting peculiarly, making trips out in boats, meeting with people who have no business in this community. I want explanations, and I want them immediately." "I'm afraid," Cardew said quietly, "that I cannot provide explanations about private matters relating to my position." "Private matters?" the man said, his voice rising. "There is nothing private about signal lights and unauthorized use of island property. This island belongs to the Crown, and activities upon it are subject to scrutiny. I am the magistrate for this district, and I have every right to investigate. Either you provide explanations voluntarily, or I will pursue this matter through proper legal channels." Holmes descended the stairs with the kind of deliberate calm that Watson had learned indicated he had already formed conclusions about the situation and was moving to implement a strategy. "Mr. Holmes," the magistrate said, though it was clear from his expression that he did not know who Holmes was, only that Holmes was someone new and therefore someone who might be forced to provide answers. "I don't believe I have had the pleasure." "Sherlock Holmes," Holmes said, extending his hand, "consulting detective from London, and this is Dr. John Watson. We are here at the request of Mr. Cardew to investigate the signal lights that have been appearing on the island. Our investigation is complete. We have discovered the source of the signals, and we have determined that they present no threat to the community or to Crown property." "I don't give a damn who you are," the magistrate said, declining the handshake. "I give a damn about maintaining order in my district. Those signals are disturbing. They are unexplained, and they are occurring on property that is under Crown jurisdiction. Someone is on that island, and that someone needs to be identified and dealt with according to law. The someone," Holmes said, his voice remaining perfectly level, "is a British subject who has harmed no one, stolen nothing, and violated no law. He is an old man living in what amounts to shelter, sustaining himself through his own efforts. He has broken no statute that would come under civilian jurisdiction." "That remains to be determined," the magistrate said. "I will be taking a boat to that island at first light. I will be conducting a proper investigation, and if there is someone there, that person will be questioned and, if necessary, taken into custody for further interrogation." "On what charge?" Holmes asked. The magistrate hesitated. It was a small hesitation, but it was there. "Trespassing on Crown property, unauthorized habitation, suspicious activity." "Trespassing requires intent to occupy land not one's own, with the purpose of causing damage or disruption," Holmes said, with the kind of precision that came from intimate knowledge of law. "An old man sheltering in ruins that have been abandoned for decades hardly qualifies. Unauthorized habitation requires that there be authorization that was sought and denied. No such authorization was requested, therefore no such denial occurred. And suspicious activity is sufficiently vague that any activity at all could be classified under that description, which means it is legally meaningless." The magistrate's face darkened further. "I don't need lessons in law from a London detective. I need answers, and I will get them. Either voluntarily or through force of office. It is your choice." "My choice," Holmes said, "would be to suggest that we discuss this matter in a more private setting. The constable here has no business being involved in a conversation that would benefit from nuance and discretion. I suspect that if you think carefully about the situation, you will recognize certain advantages to handling the matter quietly rather than formally." The magistrate and Holmes regarded each other with the kind of attention that Watson had learned to recognize as two powerful minds taking the measure of one another. The constable shifted uncomfortably, clearly unaware of the undercurrents moving through the conversation. "Stand outside," the magistrate said to the constable without breaking eye contact with Holmes. "I will call if I need you." The constable departed, and when the door had closed behind him, the magistrate gestured toward the sitting room. "We will speak privately," he said. They settled into the sitting room. The door closed behind them. David had been sent upstairs at Holmes's gesture. The young man had acquiesced, though not without obvious reluctance. Cardew remained, standing by the mantelpiece, his expression carefully neutral. "Now," the magistrate said, settling into a chair with the bearing of a man who expected to dominate the conversation, "tell me the truth about what has been happening here." Holmes regarded him for a long moment before responding. When he did speak, his voice was different than it had been. Not softer exactly, but more measured, more contemplative. "There is a man on the island," Holmes said. "His name is Thomas Whitmore. He's 73 years old, and he's been living there for 22 years. He's not a criminal. He's not a threat to anyone. He's a man who was exiled from society for reasons that the society in question deemed sufficient, but which would not survive modern scrutiny. He has lived quietly, harmed no one, and remained in his self-imposed solitude out of respect for the judgment that was passed upon him." "And the signals?" the magistrate asked. "The signals are recent," Holmes said. "They began approximately 6 weeks ago. They are the result of a letter that reached him, a letter from someone from his past whom he had believed lost to him forever. The signals are his attempt to respond, to communicate across distance, to make known that he is alive and that his love was not forgotten. The magistrate's expression shifted. Something in what Holmes had said had registered differently than he had anticipated. A love letter, the magistrate said. He is sending love letters in code to someone in Australia? In essence, yes, Holmes said, though the situation is considerably more complicated than that simple description suggests. There are reasons, historical reasons, legal reasons, social reasons, why this man was exiled. Those reasons relate to the particular nature of his love, and those reasons, I would suggest, are reasons that a man of discretion might prefer not to pursue further. The magistrate stood and moved to the window. He looked out toward the island, toward the darkness that concealed whatever structures or people might be there. His hands were clasped behind his back, his posture thoughtful. "How long has he been there?" the magistrate asked. 22 years, Holmes repeated. As I mentioned, he arrived after the scandal that necessitated his departure from society. He has remained for over 2 decades. And no one has thought to remove him? To report him? The lighthouse keeper was aware of his presence, Holmes said. But he is a man who understands exile, who understands the reasons a person might choose solitude over exposure. The harbour master became aware of his presence more recently and chose to ensure that the man was not dying of deprivation. His son, David Tremaine, has taken responsibility for ensuring that the exile is not absolute, that there is some small contact with the human world, some acknowledgement that the man still matters. The magistrate turned from the window. His expression had changed. The anger that had been present earlier had been replaced by something more complex, uncertainty, perhaps, or the dawning realization that the situation was more nuanced than his initial impression had suggested. "What was the scandal?" the magistrate asked. "That is not my business to discuss," Holmes said. "It is sufficient to say that it was the kind of scandal that resulted in exile rather than prosecution, which suggests that even the authorities of the time recognized that the situation was more delicate than the law could properly address." The magistrate returned to his chair. He seemed, Watson thought, to have aged in the last few minutes. The certainty that had driven him to the lighthouse was fading, being replaced by the kind of weariness that comes when one recognizes that a situation is more complicated than one's authority can easily resolve. "I received a complaint," the magistrate said after a long moment, "from a person who wishes to remain unnamed. The complaint alleged that there was suspicious activity on the island, that signals were being sent, that the activity might constitute a security risk. I am obligated to investigate such complaints." "Of course you are," Holmes said, "and I am not suggesting that you abandon your obligation. I am suggesting, however, that there are ways to investigate that serve the purposes of justice without causing unnecessary harm. The man on the island is old, he is harmless, and he is dying, though he does not know this yet. He has perhaps a year, perhaps less. His heart is failing. His constitution is failing. His will to continue is fading. In a year, the situation will resolve itself. In a year, you will no longer need to investigate because there will be nothing left to investigate." "That is a callous way to describe a man's death," the magistrate said. "It is a realistic way," Holmes said. "The man himself accepts it. He has accepted it for a long time. What he wants, in the time that remains to him, is to know that he was not entirely forgotten, that the love he preserved in exile was somehow remembered by the person he loved. That knowledge has now been given to him. Allowing him to live out his remaining time in peace would be, I think, a reasonable exercise of discretion." The magistrate was quiet for a very long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, quieter, less authoritative, more human. "Who filed the complaint?" Holmes asked. "I cannot say," the magistrate replied. "Complaints are received in confidence." But there was something in the way he said it that suggested he knew, that he had perhaps recognized something in the complaint that had troubled him beyond the mere facts of the case. Watson found himself leaning forward slightly, waiting for whatever revelation might come. "I suspect," the magistrate said slowly, "that the complaint came from a person who had concerns about the involvement of the harbour master's son, a person who believes that David Tremaine is being influenced by outside elements to pursue activities that are not in the best interest of the community, a person who may be motivated by professional rivalry or personal dislike." "The harbour master has business competitors," Holmes observed, "people who would benefit from his son being occupied with matters that do not serve the family's interests." "That is possible," the magistrate said. "I did not think of it in those terms when I received the complaint. I thought of it only as a matter of security, of proper procedure. But now that you mention it, I recognize that my response may have been impulsive." Holmes nodded slowly. "The situation then is this. There is a man on an island who presents no threat to anyone. There is a community that has been given cause to be suspicious of his presence through mechanisms that may not be entirely honest. And there is a young man whose life may be disrupted by investigation into activities that are, in essence, acts of compassion. All of this could be resolved if someone with authority, someone with responsibility for the maintenance of order, were to determine that the signals present no security threat and that investigation is therefore unnecessary." The magistrate stood. He moved to the mantelpiece and looked at the photograph of Cardew and his deceased friend that Watson had noticed on his first visit. "That is your friend?" the magistrate asked, pointing to the photograph. "Yes," Cardew said quietly. "A man I served with for many years. He is dead now." "Do you miss him?" "Every day," Cardew said. "I miss him every day." The magistrate was silent for a long moment. Then he turned from the photograph and looked at Holmes. "I will be returning to the village," the magistrate said. "I will be informing the constable that the signals pose no threat, that the matter requires no further investigation, and that any future complaints regarding the island will be evaluated with extreme skepticism. I am doing this not because I am entirely convinced by your arguments, Mr. Holmes, though I recognize their logic. I am doing this because I am a man who has learned, over my years in this position, that sometimes the law's proper function is to know when not to act." "That is wise," Holmes said. "There will be conditions," the magistrate continued. "The signals must cease. I cannot be seen to allow suspicious activity to continue indefinitely, even if I am choosing not to investigate it. The old man must be told that the signals have drawn attention, that if he continues I will have no choice but to take action. He must understand that his remaining peace is conditional upon his silence." "That is fair," Holmes said. The magistrate moved toward the door, then paused. "What will happen to him? After the signals cease? What will become of him?" "That remains to be determined," Holmes said. "But there are possibilities. There are always possibilities for those who are willing to imagine them." The magistrate departed, taking the constable with him. They descended to their vehicle and departed into the night, leaving behind them a house that seemed suddenly very quiet, very still, as though it had been holding its breath during the confrontation and was only now learning to breathe normally again. Cardew moved immediately to the sideboard and poured himself a glass of whisky with a hand that was not quite steady. "That was close," he said. "If he had insisted on investigating, if he had taken a boat to the island, he would have found nothing," Holmes said. "An old man would have concealed himself, the signals would have ceased, and the magistrate would have been forced to conclude that the rumours were exaggerated. But yes, it would have been uncomfortable. It would have drawn attention that we would have preferred to avoid. Now, however, we have time. We have the opportunity to act on our own terms rather than on the magistrate's." David appeared at the top of the stairs, his face pale with worry. "Is everything all right?" he asked. "What happened?" "Everything is as right as it needs to be," Holmes said. "What has happened is that we have been given a deadline. We have been given a timeline within which to act. Thomas Whitmore must cease the signals. The magistrate has made that a condition of his non-interference. But before that happens, before the signals end, we must make arrangements. We must ensure that the exile ends properly, that the love story reaches some kind of resolution." Holmes moved to the window and looked out toward the island one final time that night. "David," he said, "your grandfather, James, is still alive, I assume? Still in Australia?" "As far as I know," David said. "My father has not heard otherwise, but he is old. He's perhaps 80 years old now. I don't know if—" "Age is merely a condition," Holmes said. "What matters is whether the will to connect still exists. And if it does, then perhaps we can arrange something. Perhaps we can facilitate a final meeting, a final communication between two men who have spent their entire lives loving each other across impossible distance." "How?" David asked. "How could such a thing be arranged?" "That is what we must determine," Holmes said. "But first, we must inform Thomas Whitmore of what has occurred. We must tell him that his exile is about to end, that the signals must cease, but that something better than silence is about to begin. We must take a boat to the island tomorrow morning in daylight, and we must tell him that his story does not end in solitude, but in connection. We must tell him that love, preserved in exile, is about to be answered in ways he has not dared to imagine. The rest of the night passed in quiet conversation and planning. By the time dawn approached, the outline of a plan had begun to form, uncertain still, dependent on factors they could not control, but nonetheless a plan that offered something that had not existed before. Hope not just for connection, but for reunion. The boat moved across the water in the early morning light, the kind of light that belongs only to the hours just after dawn. Pale, uncertain, filled with the possibility of what the day might become. Thomas Whitmore stood at the highest point of the island, waiting. Somehow he knew they were coming. Perhaps it was intuition. Perhaps it was the particular quality of hope that had begun to grow in him since he had sent his signal the night before. That different signal, the one that had finally given him permission to speak freely, to release the words that had accumulated in silence for 22 years. He was smaller than Watson had expected. Age and solitude had diminished him, had worn him down to something essential, bone and will, and the particular quality of consciousness that comes from decades of being alone with one's own thoughts. But his eyes were sharp, alert, and when Holmes emerged from the boat, Whitmore smiled. "You found the letters," Whitmore said. It was not a question. "You know about James?" "We know," Holmes said simply. "We know about the exile, about the love, about the signal, and we have come to tell you that your years of silence have an ending." They sat together in the shelter, the four of them, Holmes, Watson, David, and Thomas Whitmore. The old sailor looked at David for a long moment, something shifting in his expression as he recognized, in the young man's face, echoes of features he had loved decades ago. "Your family," Whitmore said. "I am your grandson," David replied. "My grandfather was James. My mother was their daughter, born in Australia. She never knew the truth about her father, not entirely, but she knew enough. She kept your letters. She taught me to understand that some loves are worth any price, any sacrifice. She taught me to honour that understanding by caring for you." Whitmore's hands were trembling. He reached out and David took them. The hands of an old man, weathered and worn, hands that had worked ships and held lamps and written letters that would cross oceans to reach someone who could never truly respond. "James responded," Holmes said gently. 6 months ago, after your grandmother, his wife, passed away. He found the letters you had sent him all these years. He found them, and he read them, and he wrote to you. His letter reached you, and it changed everything, did it not? It told me," Whitmore said slowly, that I had not been forgotten, that across all the years, across all the distance, the love was remembered. It told me that my exile had not been in vain, that somewhere, someone was carrying the same love that I was carrying. And now," Holmes said, "we're here to tell you that the exile is ending, not through your choice, but through circumstance, through the convergence of events that no one could have predicted. There was a magistrate, there was a complaint, there were people who wanted your signals to be investigated, to be stopped. We have prevented that, investigation, but the price of that prevention is that the signals must cease. You must be silent now, but silence is not the end. It is a transition." Watson watched as understanding began to move across Whitmore's face. Slow, careful, the kind of understanding that comes when one has learned to expect disappointment, and is now being told to expect something else entirely. "What are you suggesting?" Whitmore asked. "I am suggesting," Holmes said, "that James still lives. He is in Australia. He's old, as you are old, but he's still alive. He has a family, children, grandchildren. They know nothing of the exile, nothing of the love, nothing of the truth about their grandfather's past. But James knows, and James has expressed through his letter a wish that cannot be fulfilled in his current situation, but which could be fulfilled if circumstances were different." "What wish?" Whitmore asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer. "The wish to see you one final time," Holmes said, "before the world ends for either of you. The wish to hold the hand of the man he loved when he was young, to see the face of the man he loved, to know that the exile was endured, was survived, was meaningful. That wish can be granted. It requires travel. It requires money, which we can arrange. It requires courage, which you have already demonstrated by living as you have lived. It requires only that you be willing to leave this island and embark on a journey toward reunion." Whitmore was silent for a very long time. Watson found himself holding his breath, waiting for the old man to speak, to make the choice that would either end his isolation or extend it into permanence. If I leave, Whitmore said finally, I am admitting that the exile is over. I am admitting that I cannot sustain myself here anymore, that the vigil I have kept for all these years must end. I am admitting, in essence, that I have failed. You have not failed, Holmes said quietly. You have endured. You have preserved love in the face of a world that sought to erase it. You have lived with dignity and purpose in circumstances that would have destroyed lesser men. You have signalled across the darkness night after night, refusing to be silent, refusing to accept that you did not matter. That is not failure, Mr. Whitmore, that is the definition of success. David stepped forward. I will travel with you, he said. My father has connections in shipping. We can arrange passage to Australia. I will help you travel. I will help you find my grandfather. I will be there when you meet so that the love story, our family's love story, is known, is witnessed, is preserved. Holmes withdrew a small envelope from his jacket. It was sealed, addressed to James Whitmore in care of a shipping business in Sydney. This is a letter, Holmes said. It's from Thomas. It tells James that you are coming. It explains everything that needs to be explained. It prepares him for what is about to happen. When you arrive in Sydney, you will deliver this letter, and then you will have the remainder of your life to understand what it means to be together. Finally, after all these years. Whitmore took the letter with reverent care. His hands had stopped trembling. There was a calm that had settled over him, the kind of calm that comes when a decision has been made, when the path forward, though uncertain, is nonetheless clear. How much time do I have? Whitmore asked. The magistrate expects the signals to cease immediately, Holmes said. You have perhaps a week to prepare, to gather what you wish to keep, to make peace with this island that has been your home. Then we will arrange your departure. You will go first to Penzance, then to Plymouth, then to the ship that will carry you across the world to Australia. By late autumn, you will be in Sydney. By winter, you will have met your lover again. And if I am not well enough? Whitmore asked. If the journey is too much, if my heart... Then you will die knowing that you tried, Holmes said, that you took the chance, that you did not spend your final days in silence but in pursuit of something that mattered. That is the only victory that matters, Mr. Whitmore. That is the only ending that counts. Over the following hours, they helped Whitmore gather his few possessions, the logbook, the letters from James, the volumes of poetry he had read so many times that they were nearly memorized. They helped him understand that the island, which had been his refuge, was releasing him now, was giving him permission to leave, was allowing him to understand that exile need not be permanent, that even the longest silences can be broken. When they departed the island in the afternoon light, Thomas Whitmore was with them. He looked back only once, watching the shelter recede, watching the place that had held him for 22 years disappear behind the growing distance of water. But there was no sadness in his backward glance. Only acknowledgement, only gratitude, only the particular quality of peace that comes when a chapter of one's life is finally, genuinely ending. At Fenwick Head, Cardew was waiting. When he saw Whitmore emerge from the boat, something broke open in the old lighthouse keeper's face. The two men looked at each other, two men who had been separated by distance, by circumstance, by the particular cruelty of a world that had decided they should not know each other. And without speaking they embraced, and in that embrace was the acknowledgement of all the years of solitude that both had endured, and the recognition that such solitude was now, finally ending. You will help him? Cardew asked Holmes. The arrangements are already being made, Holmes said. By this time next year, Thomas Whitmore will be in Australia, will have been reunited with James, will have discovered what it means to live openly, to exist without exile. It will not be perfect. They are old men now. They do not have decades together, but they will have time. They will have the chance to hold each other without fear. That is enough. That night the light on the island remained dark. For the first time in 6 weeks there was no signal. But the silence was not empty. It was full of meaning, full of transition, full of the particular quality that comes when a long chapter is finally closing and a new one is about to begin. Watson found himself at the window as evening fell, looking out toward the place where the island was, thinking about Thomas Whitmore, about the exile that was ending, about the love that had survived 22 years of silence and separation. There was something profoundly human about it, something that spoke to the deepest part of what it meant to persist, to endure, to refuse to let the world's judgment become your own. "It is a good ending," Holmes said, appearing beside him at the window. "Not happy precisely. They are too old for happiness, perhaps. But good, true, earned. That is all that matters in the end, Watson. That is all that anyone truly needs." And as the darkness gathered outside, as the sea continued its eternal conversation with itself, somewhere on an old ship sailing toward distant shores, an old sailor sat in his cabin, holding a letter, reading words that had been written years before, understanding at last that the love he had preserved in exile was about to be answered in ways he had never quite dared to believe were possible. The signal had ended, but the story, the true story, the one that mattered, was only beginning.